Story 1. The Mall Santa. This happened when I was 16, back in December 2015. I'd gotten my first real job working at the mall, at this clothing store called PacSun. It was actually perfect timing because they needed extra help for the holiday rush, and I needed money for Christmas presents. And honestly, just to have some spending money. The mall during Christmas was insane, like absolutely packed every single day. The decorations were everywhere. They played the same 10 Christmas songs on repeat until you wanted to lose your mind. And there was this huge Santa setup right in the center court where kids could get their pictures taken. I walked past it probably 20 times a shift going to the food court or taking my breaks. The Santa they had that year was new. I only know that because my coworker Emma had worked there the previous Christmas and she mentioned it. She said the old Santa was this jolly older guy who was super nice to everyone. But this new Santa was different. He was younger, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, hard to tell with the beard. And he was quiet, like weirdly quiet for someone playing Santa. I didn't pay much attention to him at first. I mean, it's a mall Santa, right? But then I started noticing he'd watch people. Not the kids in line. He'd watch the teenage girls walking by. I caught him doing it a few times when I was on break, sitting on the bench near the food court. He'd be in his Santa chair during a lull, and his eyes would just follow girls as they walked past. It made me uncomfortable, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just people watching. Maybe I was reading into it. I didn't want to be that person who assumes the worst about everyone. But then one day, I was working the closing shift. It was a Tuesday, maybe 2 weeks before Christmas. The mall closed at 9 p.m. on weekdays, and I got off at 9:30 after we finished cleaning up and counting the register. Emma and I left together like we always did, walking out through the main entrance near the Santa setup. The Santa area was closed, obviously. The lights were off, the velvet ropes were up, and I could see them wheeling the big chair into storage for the night. But as we walked past, I saw him. The Santa. He was out of costume, just wearing jeans and a black hoodie, standing near the entrance to the employee corridor. And he was staring at me. Not just looking, staring. With this expression I can't really describe. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't neutral. It was intense. Emma didn't notice because she was looking at her phone, texting her mom that we were leaving. But I noticed. I remember my pace slowing down for a second, and then I forced myself to keep walking normally. I didn't want him to know I'd seen him watching. We got to Emma's car and I asked her, trying to sound casual, if she'd noticed the Santa guy acting weird. She laughed and said all mall Santas are weird. It's part of the job description. I didn't push it. Over the next week, I started seeing him more often. Not in costume, but around the mall. I'd be on my lunch break at Panda Express and I'd look up and he'd be sitting at a table by himself, watching me eat. I'd be walking to work from the parking lot, and I'd catch a glimpse of him standing near the entrance, like he was waiting for something or someone. The thing that really freaked me out happened on a Saturday night. It was December 19th. I remember because it was exactly a week before Christmas, and the mall was absolutely mobbed. My shift ended at 8 p.m. that night, and I texted my mom to pick me up because Emma wasn't working. My mom said she'd be there in 20 minutes. She was finishing dinner. I waited in the store for a bit, helping close up even though I was off the clock, just to kill time. Then I went outside to wait near the entrance where my mom usually picked me up. It was cold, probably in the 30s, and I was wearing my work clothes, which weren't exactly warm. I stood under the overhang, scrolling on my phone, watching for my mom's car. That's when I felt someone standing close to me, too close. I looked up, and it was him. The Santa guy, out of costume, wearing that same black hoodie, hands in his pockets, standing maybe 2 feet away from me. Waiting for someone? He asked. His voice was soft, almost whispery. I nodded, didn't say anything, just nodded and looked back at my phone, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. He didn't leave. He just stood there. After maybe 30 seconds of the most uncomfortable silence of my life, he said, "You work at PacSun." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Like he'd been paying attention. Like he knew. "Yeah," I said, my voice coming out shakier than I wanted. "My mom's picking me up soon." I don't know why I told him that. Maybe I thought mentioning my mom would make him back off, make him realize I wasn't alone or vulnerable or whatever he was thinking. He smiled, this slow smile that didn't reach his eyes. That's good. It's not safe for pretty girls to be alone at night. The way he said, pretty girls, made my skin crawl. I was 16. I looked 16. There was no mistaking me for an adult. I saw my mom's car pulling into the lot and I immediately started walking toward it, not even saying goodbye to this guy, just walking fast. I heard him call out behind me, "See you around." I got in my mom's car and locked the door immediately. She asked if I was okay, and I just nodded, but I wasn't. I was shaking. I told her about the guy, about how he'd been watching me, about what he said. My mom's face went hard and she said we were reporting this to mall security right then. We drove back to the entrance and found a security guard. Told him everything. The guard took it seriously, asked for a description, said he'd talked to the management company that hired the Santas. He took down my phone number and said they'd follow up. 2 days later, December 21st, I got a call from the mall security office. They told me the Santa had been fired immediately and was banned from the property. Apparently, when they pulled his application and ran a deeper background check, they found out he'd been arrested 5 years earlier for following a teenage girl home from a different mall. The charges were eventually dropped, which is why it didn't show up on the initial check, but it was enough for them to terminate him on the spot. The security guy also told me something that still bothers me. He said when they reviewed the security footage, they found clips of the Santa guy following me through the mall on multiple occasions, following me to my car in the parking lot, sitting in his car and watching the store I worked at during my shifts. For almost 2 weeks. I didn't work the last few days before Christmas. I called in, told my manager what happened, and she completely understood. Emma worked my shifts and texted me updates, saying she hadn't seen him around, but that security was doing extra patrols. I went back after New Year's when the holiday stuff was all torn down and there was a different Santa setup, and things felt normal again. But I never stopped checking behind me in parking lots. Never stopped being aware of who's watching. That was almost 10 years ago, and I still think about it every Christmas season. What was he planning? How long had he been watching me before I noticed? I'm just grateful my mom took it seriously and that mall security actually did something. I think about other girls who might not have been that lucky. Story 2. The Family Christmas Party. I was 23 when this happened, December of 2019. My girlfriend at the time, Jess, invited me to her family's Christmas party. We'd been dating for about 8 months, and this was going to be my first time meeting her extended family. I was nervous, obviously, because you want to make a good impression, you know? But Jess kept telling me her family was super chill and not to worry. The party was at her aunt's house in this nice neighborhood in suburban Michigan. Like one of those neighborhoods where all the houses look expensive and there's a homeowners association that probably fines you if your grass is too long. Jess's aunt and uncle had lived there for like 20 years and always hosted the big family Christmas party. We got there around 6 p.m. on a Saturday, and the place was already packed. Probably 30 or 40 people. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends, all ages. The house was decorated to the absolute max with Christmas stuff. Lights, garland, a massive tree, the works. There was food everywhere, Christmas music playing, kids running around. It was honestly overwhelming, but in that nice, festive way. Jess introduced me to everyone. Her parents, who I'd already met, her grandparents, various aunts and uncles whose names I immediately forgot. Everyone was friendly and welcoming. The uncle hosting, Uncle Mike, was one of those loud, jovial guys who makes sure everyone has a drink in their hand and is having a good time. There was also Uncle Mike's friend there. I don't remember his name, which bothers me because I feel like I should. But let's call him David because I need to call him something. David was maybe in his mid-50s, balding, kind of heavy-set, wearing an ugly Christmas sweater that looked genuinely vintage, not ironic. Uncle Mike introduced him as his best friend from college, said David comes to every family party. He's basically family. David seemed nice at first. He shook my hand, asked how Jess and I met, normal small talk stuff. But then I noticed he had this habit of standing really close when he talked to you. Like uncomfortably close, and he'd touch your arm or shoulder when he was making a point. Not aggressive, but just more physical than felt appropriate with a stranger. I tried to brush it off. Some people are just like that, right? Overly friendly, don't have great boundaries. I didn't want to be rude at my girlfriend's family party. The party went on. We ate dinner, played some white elephant gift game that got weirdly competitive, hung out by the fireplace. I was actually having a pretty good time and felt like I was fitting in okay. Jess seemed happy, which made me happy. Around 9 p.m., Jess went upstairs to help her aunt with something in the kitchen. I was down in the finished basement with a bunch of other people, watching some Christmas movie on TV. The basement was set up like a rec room, big sectional couch, pool table, bar area. Pretty nice setup. David came down the stairs and sat next to me on the couch. Not unusual. There were like 10 people down there, but then everyone else gradually filtered upstairs over the next 20 minutes, getting more food, using the bathroom, whatever, until it was just me and David in the basement. I was on my phone, scrolling through Instagram, not really watching the movie. David was just sitting there, and I could feel him looking at me. I glanced over, and yeah, he was staring right at me with this strange expression. "You seem like a good kid," he said suddenly. I gave him this awkward smile and was like, "Thanks, I try." "Jess is lucky to have you," he continued. "Young love is beautiful." The way he said young love was weird. Too much emphasis. Too wistful. I nodded and looked back at my phone, hoping he'd drop it. He didn't. He leaned closer and said, quieter now, "You two been intimate yet?" I felt my whole body go tense. That is not something a random middle-aged man should be asking his friend's niece's boyfriend. I tried to laugh it off, said something like, "That's personal, man," and stood up like I was going to head back upstairs. David grabbed my wrist. Not hard, but firm enough that I stopped. "I'm just asking because I want to make sure you're treating her right. Girls like Jess, they need to be handled carefully, gently." The way he said gently and the way he was gripping my wrist made every alarm in my head go off. I pulled my arm away and said, "I'm going to go find Jess." I went upstairs immediately, my heart pounding. Found Jess in the kitchen with her aunt and a few other women. I pulled her aside and told her, quietly, what David had said. Her face went from confused to disgusted in about 2 seconds. "That's so fucking inappropriate," she said. She wasn't quiet about it either. Her aunt overheard and asked what was wrong. Jess told her, and her aunt's expression turned angry. Within 5 minutes, half the party knew what David had said. Jess's dad and Uncle Mike went down to the basement to talk to him. I don't know exactly what was said because I stayed upstairs with Jess, but we heard raised voices. David came up the basement stairs maybe 10 minutes later, grabbed his coat, and left. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. Uncle Mike came over to me and apologized, looking genuinely mortified. He said he'd known David for 30 years and had no idea he'd do something like that he was sorry I'd been put in that situation. Jess's dad also apologized and said I'd handled it exactly right by telling Jess immediately. The party kind of broke up after that. The mood had shifted and people started leaving pretty quickly. Jess and I left around 10:30. In the car, she kept apologizing and saying she couldn't believe that happened. I told her it wasn't her fault, that her family handled it well, that I was fine. But honestly, I wasn't fine. Something about the way David had grabbed my wrist and said, "gently," in that specific tone made my skin crawl. It wasn't just inappropriate, it was predatory. A few days later, Jess told me that after the party, her aunt had talked to some of the other family members. Turns out David had made weird comments to people before. Nothing quite as blatant as what he said to me, but inappropriate jokes, standing too close to the younger female cousins, asking personal questions about people's relationships. Everyone had just kind of written it off as David being awkward, or that's just how he is. Uncle Mike cut ties with him completely. Said he couldn't believe he'd been friends with someone like that for so long without seeing it. Jess and I broke up about a year later for unrelated reasons, but I still think about that Christmas party sometimes. I think about how many times David had probably crossed lines and everyone just made excuses for him because he was family friend. I think about how if I'd been a young woman instead of a young man, maybe he would have been even more aggressive. I'm glad I spoke up right away and that Jess's family took it seriously. But it ruined Christmas parties for me for a while. I always felt on edge, wondering who in the room might be hiding that kind of behavior behind a friendly smile and an ugly Christmas sweater. Story 3: The Christmas Eve Shift. Back when I was 19, I worked at a 24-hour diner in rural Pennsylvania. This was December 2017. The diner was one of those classic chrome and red vinyl places that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s, which honestly was part of its charm. We got a weird mix of truckers, shift workers, and random travelers coming off the highway. I usually worked the late shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., because it paid a little extra, and I was saving up for community college. Most nights were pretty dead after 2 a.m. You'd get maybe one or two customers an hour, max. It gave me plenty of time to study or scroll on my phone while refilling the napkin holders for the 100th time. Christmas Eve fell on a Sunday that year, and the owner asked if anyone was willing to work the overnight. Most of my coworkers had families and wanted to be home for Christmas morning, so I volunteered. I didn't really celebrate Christmas. My family was never big on it, and the holiday pay was time and a half. Easy money. The shift started out normal. We had a decent dinner rush with families stopping on their way to relatives' houses. Then it died down by 10 p.m. My coworker Lisa left at 11, and then it was just me and the night cook, Eddie, in the building. Eddie was in his 60s, mostly kept to himself in the kitchen. We had a system where I'd ring the bell if I got an order and he'd cook it, but otherwise, we didn't really interact. Around midnight, a guy came in and sat at the counter. He was maybe in his 40s, wearing a heavy winter coat and a beanie, looking kind of rough, like he'd been on the road for a while. He ordered coffee and a burger. Didn't say much. I brought him his food and he ate in silence, scrolling on his phone. He finished around 12:30, paid his check, and left. Normal transaction. Except about 10 minutes later, I saw his truck was still in the parking lot. He was just sitting there in his truck, engine running, exhaust visible in the cold air. I didn't think too much of it at first. Maybe he was making a phone call or checking directions or something. But then 20 minutes passed, and he was still there, just sitting in his truck, facing the diner. Around 1:15 a.m., he came back inside, said he'd forgotten his phone charger, asked if I'd seen one. I checked the booth and the counter where he'd been sitting. Nothing there. Told him we didn't have it. He nodded slowly and just stood there for a minute, not leaving, not saying anything. Then he ordered another coffee. He sat back down at the counter, drinking this second coffee incredibly slowly, not looking at his phone this time, just staring at the wall behind me. The clock. The old photos of the diner from the 50s. Me, whenever he thought I wasn't looking. I started feeling uneasy. I texted my friend Kayla, told her there was a weird guy at the diner making me uncomfortable. She said to tell Eddie or call the cops if I felt unsafe. But I felt stupid, you know? The guy hadn't actually done anything threatening. He was just there. He left again around 2 a.m. I watched through the windows as he got in his truck, and once again, he didn't drive away. Just sat there with the engine running. I went back to the kitchen and told Eddie about it. Eddie looked out the back door into the parking lot, saw the truck, and his expression got serious. He said, "If he comes back in, I'm calling the cops. That's not normal." But the guy didn't come back in. He just sat in that truck for another 30 minutes. By 2:30, I was genuinely freaked out. I kept peeking out the windows, and he was always in the same position, just sitting there. Then finally, he drove away. His truck pulled out of the lot and disappeared down the highway. I felt this huge wave of relief. Eddie and I joked about it nervously, trying to convince ourselves it was nothing. Maybe the guy had been drunk and was sleeping it off. Maybe he was having car trouble. Maybe he was just a weirdo but harmless. The rest of the shift was dead. No customers at all from 2:30 to 5:30, which wasn't unusual for Christmas Eve. At 5:45, a state trooper came in for coffee, which was part of his regular route. I mentioned the weird guy to him, kind of laughing about it, and the trooper's face went still. "What kind of truck?" he asked. I described it. Dark blue pickup, looked older, maybe a Ford. The trooper asked if I got the license plate. I hadn't. He told me to describe the guy. I did. 40s, heavyset, beanie, rough looking. The trooper got this grim expression and pulled out his phone, showed me a photo. "This him?" It was him. Exactly him. The trooper told me the guy's name, I won't repeat it here, and said he was wanted for questioning in connection with an assault on a waitress at a truck stop about out 80 miles away. Last week. The woman had been closing alone, and the guy had come back after hours, tried to force his way into the locked diner. She'd barricaded herself in the kitchen and called 911, but he was gone before police arrived. I felt like I was going to throw up. The trooper asked if the guy had said anything threatening or tried to touch me. I said no, just the weird hovering and the sitting in the parking lot. The trooper said I'd done the right thing being aware of my surroundings, that it was good Eddie was there. He called it in, gave the description and direction of travel, said they'd patrol the area. Then he told me something I'll never forget. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't worry about being polite. The trooper stayed until Eddie and I locked up at 7 a.m. when the morning shift arrived. I found out later they caught the guy 2 days after Christmas at a rest stop in Ohio. He'd been driving around to different diners and truck stops, watching female employees working alone. I quit that job about a month later. Not just because of that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling every time I worked a late shift. Couldn't stop looking out the windows at the parking lot, checking if anyone was sitting in their car just watching. My mom asked why I quit, and I didn't tell her the real reason because I knew she'd freak out. I just said I wanted to focus on school. It's been years now, and I still think about that Christmas Eve. How close it might have been to being a very different story if he'd decided to come back after Eddie left at 6 a.m. How many other waitresses he'd probably watched before and after me. How I almost didn't trust my instincts because I didn't want to seem paranoid or rude. I never worked food service again. Couldn't do it. Story 4. The Apartment Neighbor. This happened in December 2016. I was 25 and had just moved into my first solo apartment in Portland, Oregon. Before that, I'd always had roommates, but I'd finally gotten a decent paying job and could afford a studio on my own. It wasn't anything fancy, 4th floor of an older building, kind of small, but it was mine, and I loved it. I moved in at the start of December, so the building was already decorated for Christmas. The landlord had put up lights in the hallways, and there was a tree in the lobby. It felt cozy and welcoming. Most of my neighbors seemed cool, young professionals, a few older couples, pretty quiet overall. The apartment directly across the hall from me was occupied by a guy who looked to be in his late 30s. I'd seen him a few times in passing, usually when I was taking out trash or checking my mail. We'd do that neighbor nod thing, but never really talked. He seemed normal enough. About a week after I moved in, I started noticing he'd sometimes be in the hallway when I was coming or going. Not every time, but often enough that I started to wonder if it was coincidental. Like I'd be leaving for work at 8 a.m., and he'd be standing by his door, fiddling with his keys like he was about to leave too. Or I'd come home at 6 p.m., and he'd be in the hallway checking his mail, even though the mail usually came in the afternoon. I tried not to read into it. We were neighbors. Of course, we'd run into each other sometimes. But it started to feel coordinated. Then one day, mid-December, I came home from grocery shopping. I was carrying like 4 bags, struggling to get my key in the lock, and he opened his door, stepped out into the hallway, and just stood there watching me struggle. After a few seconds, he said, "Need help?" I said I was fine. Almost had it. Got my door open and went inside, locked it behind me. Put the groceries away and tried to shake off the weird feeling. Maybe he was just being neighborly and I was being paranoid. But then it kept happening. He'd be there when I was leaving, there when I was coming home, and he'd always have some comment. Long day? Cold out there? Nice sweater. Never anything overtly inappropriate, but the frequency and timing felt deliberate. One night, probably about a week before Christmas, I was lying in bed scrolling through Netflix trying to figure out what to watch. It was probably 11 p.m., and I heard my doorknob rattle. I froze, just completely froze in bed, staring at my door in the dark. The knob turned, like someone was testing to see if it was locked. It was locked, obviously. I always locked it, but someone was trying it anyway. I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, and waited. After maybe 5 seconds, the rattling stopped. I heard footsteps in the hallway moving away from my door. I got up, looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but I could see the neighbor's door across the hall was slightly ajar, like someone had just gone inside and not closed it all the way yet. My heart was racing. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, but no, someone had definitely tried my doorknob. I texted my friend Becca, freaking out about it, and she told me to report it to the landlord in the morning and maybe get a security camera. I barely slept that night, kept listening for sounds in the hallway. The next day, I went to the building office and told the property manager what happened. She took it seriously, said she'd review the hallway security cameras. We had cameras in the stairwells and by the elevators, but not in the actual hallways, which seemed like a design flaw. She called me that afternoon and asked if I could come back to the office. When I got there, she showed me footage from the stairwell camera. Around 11:05 p.m., my neighbor had exited the stairwell onto my floor. The camera showed him walking down the hall toward where our apartments were. But once he was past the camera's angle, she couldn't see what he did. Then about 2 minutes later, he came back into frame, heading toward his apartment. The timing matched exactly when I'd heard my doorknob rattle. The property manager said this wasn't enough proof that he'd tried my door specifically, but combined with my complaint, she'd talked to him. I asked her if other tenants had complained about him, and she got this look, like she wanted to say yes, but legally couldn't. She said, "I'll look into it and get back to you." A few days later, she called and told me they'd given the neighbor a warning. Apparently, when confronted, he claimed he'd been confused and accidentally tried my door, thinking it was his. The property manager said if it happened again to call the police immediately and they'd begin eviction proceedings. I felt slightly better, but not safe. How do you confuse your own apartment door for one directly across the hall? Our doors were clearly marked with different numbers. Christmas came and went. I went home to visit my parents for a few days, which gave me a break from the apartment. When I came back on December 27th, I felt a little better. Maybe the warning had scared him straight. But then, on New Year's Eve, I was home alone. I'd turned down party invites because I had a cold and just wanted to sleep. Around 10 p.m., I was in bed watching TV when I heard a knock on my door. I looked through the peephole. It was him, the neighbor, just standing there in the hallway, looking directly at the peephole like he knew I was looking. I didn't answer, just stood there frozen, watching him through the peephole. He knocked again. Then he said, loud enough that I could hear through the door, "I know you're home. I saw you come back." I immediately called 911, told them someone was banging on my door and wouldn't leave, that I'd reported him before for trying my doorknob. The dispatcher said officers were on the way and to stay inside with the door locked. The neighbor stood there for another minute, knocked one more time, then finally walked away. I kept watching through the peephole until I saw him go into his apartment. The cops showed up maybe 10 minutes later. I let them in, explained everything. The pattern of him being in the hallway, the doorknob incident, the property manager's warning, and now this. They went across the hall and knocked on his door. I watched through my peephole as he answered, talked to them for a few minutes. I couldn't hear what was said, but the cops came back and told me they'd had a conversation with him and he was cooperative. That was it. That was all they could do. Because he hadn't actually broken any laws. He'd knocked on my door, which isn't illegal. He'd said something vaguely creepy, but not threatening enough to arrest him for. The cops told me to document everything, keep calling if he bothered me again, and consider a restraining order if his behavior continued. Then they left. I didn't sleep at all that night. I packed a bag and went to Becca's place the next morning, stayed there for 3 days. When I told my landlord I wanted out of my lease because of a harassment situation, she was understanding, but said I'd still owe money for breaking the lease early. I ended up moving out at the end of January. Lost my security deposit and had to pay an early termination fee. But I didn't care. I couldn't stay in that apartment. About a month after I moved, Becca told me she'd heard from someone else who lived in that building that the neighbor had been evicted in February. Apparently, after I left, he'd started doing the same thing to another woman who moved into my old unit. She reported him multiple times, and the building finally had enough documented evidence to evict him for harassment. I still think about that apartment sometimes, especially around Christmas. How excited I'd been to finally live alone, to have my own space, and how quickly it turned into not feeling safe in my own home. The worst part is he never technically did anything illegal enough to be arrested. Just a pattern of behavior that was threatening and wrong, but hard to prove or prosecute. It makes you realize how many people, especially women, deal with this kind of thing and have no real recourse until something worse happens. I'm in a better apartment now, a building with cameras in every hallway and a doorman. I'll never live somewhere without good security again. And I still check my peephole before I open my door, every single time.